I've never gotten such a welcome just for saying who I am. This is a wonderful crowd. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 9th annual Cummings-Perucci Lecture, hosted by Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. The Cummings-Perucci Lecture Series rotates between the Department of Sociology, African American Studies, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. The lecture series focuses on class, race, and gender inequality. This year's talk is entitled Reimagining Equality, Inclusive Communities in Post-Obama America. This event was made possible by the Cummings-Perucci Endowment, as well as co-sponsorships from various campus partners, including the Black Cultural Center, the Center for Advocacy, Response, and Education, otherwise known as CARE, the Susan Buckley Center for Leadership Excellence, the Division of Diversity and Inclusion, Purdue's Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Center, of course our own Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, and Advanced Purdue Center for Faculty Success. I would now like to introduce Professor T.J. Boisseau. Actually, I just forgot a little piece of business. I would like to ask you to please refrain from videotaping or taking pictures during this evening's event. So if you could please do that. And then also, if you forgot to turn off your phone, which I just realized I forgot to do, so I'll be doing that as soon as I sit down. We really don't want you to take an important call during this lecture. So now, back to my prepared remarks. I would now like to introduce Professor T.J. Boisseau, who will introduce this evening's speaker. Tracy Jean Boisseau is Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She served as the director of the program from 2012 to 2016 and did the initial work to bring Anita Hill to campus. So she is really who you have to thank for this evening. Professor Boisseau was a U.S. Fulbright Scholar to Iceland this past spring, and in 2003 to 4, she was on a Fulbright in Germany. She earned her PhD in U.S. Women's History from Binghamton University in New York in 1996. Her many articles and books, including White Queen, Mae French Sheldon, and the Imperial Origins of American Feminist Identity, explore the historical formation of American feminism as an idea, as a hegemonic subject position, and as an identity in a transnational context. Please join me in welcoming Professor Boisseau.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here and honored by the privilege of introducing to you Professor Anita Hill. We know Anita Hill, or we think we do, for a very good reason. Her testimony in 1991 changed, and for many started, a national conversation about sexism, power, and the politics of sexual harassment that went deep into our national consciousness, forcing many to consider not only what defines harassment or violence against women, but what remains in our culture that insists on the sexualization of women as if our sexuality were the only or the most important measure of our worth. Anita Hill gave us all a language, legal and cultural, ethical and moral, with which to arm ourselves in the insistence that we be judged by the value of our contribution to our workplaces, our civic communities, our families, and our world. In many ways, in 1991, Anita Hill was an every woman, not an activist with a political agenda. She was every woman who had been demeaned and intimidated, dehumanized, and dismissed at her workplace. But of course, Anita Hill was also a specific and superlative person, a black woman who is the granddaughter of a man born into slavery and the youngest of 13 children, growing up on a 240-acre family farm in Lone Tree, Oklahoma, had earned highest honors as valedictorian of her high school. She was a woman who, as a young person, had graduated from Yale Law School and passed the District of Columbia Bar with honor. She was a woman who, as a young professional, had taken a position in the United States Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, and then the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and following that had returned to university life to teach and serve as a professor of law and social policy. Throughout her young and working life, Anita Hill showed herself to be a model of private integrity and professional success. So that the idea that even with all her accolades, accomplishments, credentials, and all her grace and personal honor, a personal honor that no one who watched or listened to Anita Hill's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee that balmy October in 1991 will ever forget. That even someone as dignified and distinguished as Anita Hill could be subjected to the behind closed doors petty humiliations of an unethical supervisor, a supervisor, ironically enough, of an office created specifically to protect workers. That even in such an office, even as dignified and distinguished a person as Anita Hill, could be subjected to harassment only to be followed by the magnitude of scrutiny, interrogation, doubt, derision, dismissal, and defamation that those hearings subjected her to publicly. In the face of all this, what Anita Hill's display of personal courage and dignity meant was that all of us, who were not so distinguished in our public lives, nor perhaps so dignified in our private, all of us were somehow freed of the load of self-doubt and self-recrimination, shame and cynicism that we carried around on our shoulders, and that made us question ourselves instead of accusing a system that protected those who would demean us and delimit our ambitions. In 1991, despite the devastating outcome of those hearings, Anita Hill showed us a way forward. Over a quarter century later, women are in a different place because of Anita Hill's courage, because of her honesty, her straightforward speaking truth to power, her capacity to maintain grace amidst a process meant to strip her of her dignity. Over this last quarter century, we have watched as Anita Hill parlayed that initial public lesson into the production of more wisdom and insight as private university professor of social policy, law, and women's studies at Brandeis University, and as author of books on sexual harassment, on women judges, and on the nefarious racial and class politics structuring our banking system. We have much to thank Professor Hill for in our past, and much to learn from her in our present. I am more than pleased to hear what she has to say to us now, and ask you to stand with me to welcome to Purdue, Professor Anita Hill.
Current interim director, but that really is, for me, high honor. I have such respect for what we do with our programs around communities that I enter into, whether they're university communities, small universities like my own, or large universities like Purdue. Women's and Women's Studies really is, for me, an anchor. As well, I'm also affiliate of our African and African American Studies program at Brandeis. I'm not, however, a sociologist, but I will try to make this coming Ferrucci lecture something that really speaks to all of those interests and the work that each of you do. And I do thank you for this honor of being here tonight to deliver the Cummings Ferrucci lecture. For the past 20 years, I've focused my work as a lawyer and now as a professor of law and policy to brandeis of race, gender, class, and the inequalities that sort of have multiple and overlapping ways that exist. And I've attempted to take a multidisciplinary approach to combating it. So I welcome the opportunity to respond to the interests of a variety of programs. I also want to thank all of the organizers for tonight's work. I know that WDGSS is really the power behind this program. But I love the list of sponsors and supporters that came up. And I have to say that one of the sponsoring programs really stood out for me, and that was Purdue's Agricultural Office of Multicultural Programs. Now, at first I thought, well, what is that? So I looked on your website, and I was really thrilled to see it looks like me. As a matter of fact, I took it much to heart. I grew up on a farm in Oklahoma, and I will always identify myself as a woman tied to the land from generations back, and it is something that I wear proudly. And I'm glad that that multicultural element of agriculture is being represented here and promoted at Purdue. So thank you all for being here tonight. I was here 25 years ago, and it was a wonderful experience. And I've been saving up for 25 years to talk to you again. And I'll be expecting another invitation in 25 years from now. But what it means is that I have a lot to say, so let me quit beating around the bush and get to it. So I did testify 26 years ago, almost, and will be in October. And that is what I will be remembered for. And some people will ask, do you ever get tired of that? I don't get tired of it because I think we are still learning from it. And I could tell you stories about how horrible the initial experiences of being harassed were. I could even tell you stories about my Senate experience, or I could really digress and say, which of the senators do you think was worse? And we could spend all evening talking about that. Unfortunately, we are in a new day, and we almost have a new standard of which one we think might have behaved the most badly. But what I will say is that with the election of Donald Trump, a man who flaunts sexual predation and misogyny as normal, and who apparently equates those who oppose white supremacy with those who oppose it, as well as selectively supports free speech, but not for others, is in the White House. And is very much in control of the public conversation. And to start out with, we're talking about how do we have that inclusive community in a post-Obama era. In this era, if we want to have that inclusive community, we have to take back the public conversation about what that means and how it is going to flourish in this country. So that is the starting point. The new day also includes, though, other issues that directly relate to what happened in 1991. It's not just about Donald Trump. This public conversation that we're having is almost every day played out on the internet and in the newspapers about harassment and sexual assault. Whether it's at Fox News Network or Uber or even throughout the tech industry. It's all over the news. It's all over the internet. And in those same spaces, news stories from individuals marginalized because of their race, sexual, or gender identity are starting to surface. So I want us to think about what we should have learned from the Thomas Confirmation and how we can move forward, in part to capture this moment so that we can lead the conversation in a more positive direction, but also not only to sort of take back the moment, but how are we going to move forward once the Trump era ends? And it will end. And the question is, it will end. The question is, what is going to be left? And where are we going to build from that? So, I want to say how I'm going to frame tonight. I do want to focus mainly on sexual harassment, but I'm going to move from there. But one of the things that I want to kind of put into this mix is the fact that 1991 was about gender. It was clearly about gender. My testimony was about my gendered experience, workplace experience, and the aggression that was caused because of my gender. But it was also about race. And sometimes we forget that. And it was especially about race because Judge Thomas was considered for a seat to replace Thurgood Marshall. Now, as we know from our history, Justice Marshall was the architect of the legal struggle for equality, who was, as many people would have defined it in his day, a race man. He was also a proponent of government intervention to redress the harms that racism did to people of color. Now, in contrast, Justice Thomas believed the government had actually gone far enough, or maybe in some cases gone too far, and that that the advocacy for equality was not a governmental role, that period had ended. Thomas had actually declared that it was time for government to move aside and for people of color, especially black people, to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That had been a tenet, really, actually, of a whole way of thinking about people and social justice in the 1980s. It was proposed by Ronald Reagan, that in fact the problem was the government, not the systems, not the structures, but the government intervention was a problem. And Thomas was just taking off on a part of that and saying, no, government shouldn't be a partner at all, especially when it comes to race relations. And Justice Marshall, I think, again, in contrast, had always understood that institutionalized and implicit bias required robust federal intervention. He had famously said, you can't simply take the shackles off people one year and expect that they're going to compete and be able to prevail in a country where there are systems that are keeping people back regularly. So what we have in 1991 is this thinking that there was a new day, and it was a new day for race, and Thomas was going to reflect that. So throughout those hearings, no matter what the conversation was about, there was always an element of race. There was always something in the room, even though very few people wanted to talk about it. And what some people have said, and these are commentators who have observed, was that when I came on the scene, if it had been correctly analyzed, it would have been thought to have been about race and gender as an intersecting. And I know intersectionality is a common term that is used around the university, but I think what we have to do to understand what that concept means is to see it in action. And in 1991, that was what was happening. But I also don't want us to sort of think about it only as an intersectional moment. There were some gender questions, there were racial questions, and there were intersectional questions. And in some ways, that is what I want us to think about when we talk about all of the things that I'm going to present tonight and when we get to questions later. But one thing that you should know, and I believe this to be something that we have to kind of come to terms with, is that you have to know that race and gender equality are not counterparts that can be traded off. You can't just say, well, I'm going to deal with race and not gender, or I'm going to deal with gender and not race. They can't be traded off. They are so inextricably linked to each other and to other forms of bias that plague us, that in many ways, and it's difficult to do, we have to deal with all at once. And Justice Marshall, I believe, laid the groundwork through many of his decisions for getting us to be able to deal with all of these intersectional issues and to deal with the issues also separately, whether it be the same-sex marriage cases that went through the court for the last few years, whether it be voting rights cases, or whether it involved cases of sexual harassment and sexual assault. So that's the frame. And I want us to now just sort of move back to thinking about what happened in 1991. So I think of 1991 as a 20th century morality play with 21st century significance. And as I give you my interpretation of 1991, I want you to also think about how does it reflect what's going on today? How is it applicable today? So I think I can demonstrate that there are some real parallels, and though my focus will be on sexual harassment, I will close with how we can move forward on a continue with progress on a broad agenda of equality. So many of you, if you're students here, and I think some of you are, I saw some this morning, some of you were born since 1991. That's pretty fair to say that if you're faculty here, most of the people you see in the undergraduate schools are here on this earth for less than 26 years. So let's start with a little bit of background for some of them, and I hope any of you who were born before 1991 will get something out of this too. So there were protections against sexual harassment in workplaces and schools that were enshrined in law from in 1964 and 1972 respectively. Both protections are covered in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its amendment. So really, they go all the way back. They're sort of the groundwork for, the basis for protecting against sexual harassment, go back to the 1960s. Yet, it was a popular magazine in 1976, Red Book magazine, probably not even in print anymore, found that 9 out of 10 women said that they had been subjected to unwanted sexual advances. So the laws are in place, starting in the 60s, into the 70s, and in 76, 9 out of 10 women are saying that they have been subjected to unwanted sexual advances. So that was the 70s. In the 80s, the EEOC, the federal agency in charge of enforcing workplace rules against sexual harassment, had only begun to develop enforcement guidelines. And despite a ruling in favor of students' claims for protection under Title IX, which you've heard a lot about lately, I'm sure, despite the ruling in 1980, in the case of Alexander versus Yale, the Education Department offered little guidance for colleges and universities on how to process campus sexual harassment complaints. And even as late as the mid-1980s, some judges viewed sexual extortion and verbal abuse in the workplace as personal, not legal matters. So they just threw out their civil rights claims that were brought under the civil rights statute. Moreover, Marina Angel, a professor who was at Temple University at the time, did an analysis of information gathered by the American Bar Association, a survey on women in the legal profession. This was in the 90s. Found that when she did this analysis, she found that many of the people polled said the judges themselves were often harassers. Indeed, women lawyers And I made that statement at a women's judges conference, and people nodded. The judges solicited sexual favors, but it's worse than it sounds when you say judges were harassers. Judges were, in fact, and I'm quoting, soliciting sexual favors from women who came before the courts, including criminal defendants, civil litigants, lawyers, including prosecutors, public defenders, and private counsel, law clerks, law students, court employees, job applicants, probation officers, juvenile court boards, and juries. Anecdotally, I have in my files letters from students that outline the deficiencies in the way colleges dealt with sexual harassment, and that in many cases included sexual extortion and assault. One letter from a college chaplain explained that he and his wife were both employed in the chaplain's office, which became the de facto location for addressing harassment and assault complaints from student staff and faculty. The clergy staff had no training, no procedures for investigating or trying, no power to punish offenders if they concluded that a violation occurred. There wasn't agency enforcement policies. There were no practices. There was very little institutional cooperation through investigations, legal profession and court attention to enforcement of the law, and public recognition of the harm and the illegality of sexual harassment were all pretty much missing. And this really carried, even though the law was in effect, this carried on for decades. And what happened was that most people just kept quiet. People didn't talk about it because they knew they had no recourse. And the very few brave women who came through, many of them had their cases thrown out completely. But there were some women who prevailed, but it certainly was not the norm. So what they did was they left schools, they left workplaces, they abandoned dreams, and they had their hopes dashed by harassment or failed responses to it. So this was the backdrop against which I spoke under oath to the Senate. Now, anyone could tell you that if you knew that background, you probably wouldn't have thought that you had a good chance, even though I was subpoenaed to testify, that you had a good chance to be heard. You just didn't have a chance. Nevertheless, I offered my testimony as evidence of Judge Thomas's character and lack of fitness for the appointment to the country's highest court. The integrity of the court was at issue, and once confirmed, Thomas was going to sit in judgment of sexual harassment cases, but a whole host of civil rights. And it was, for me, not a claim of sexual harassment that I was putting forward on my home path. But as an officer of the court, it was my feeling, and I contend today, that the real issue was access to equal justice for everyone. And real confidence that the court that was going to be impaneled to hear, the court of last resort, to hear cases on a whole host of issues that involve the lives of people and the rights of people, that court actually had integrity. And so this is where I stood. And I came before the Senate Judiciary Committee. I had prepared my statement and given it to them, and was subpoenaed to testify. They were absolutely in no way ready to hear me testify. In fact, they didn't want me to testify at all. Had it not been for 6 congresswomen who had stormed the Senate chambers, I probably would not have been called to testify. But what it meant was that they didn't have a process. They didn't want to hear it, and they didn't have a process. 2 things were going on. One, they didn't want to deal with the content of the testimony. And secondly, they didn't want to have their whole procedures disrupted, especially by an issue which they said didn't really have any significance to them. Now, we know as a matter of fact, the history has told us that, in fact, many of the people in the Senate were probably behaving in the same way. In the Bob Packwood case, shortly after, and there were several women who came forward to talk about how they had been harassed. So what they did was they came up with this process that really was a political process. And they failed in several ways. First of all, they failed in investigation. They took 3 days to investigate my statement by having the FBI come and do an interview. Now, the FBI, as we know, is an organization that does criminal investigations. We have one going on right now. The FBI has no background or training in investigating sexual harassment. They had no understanding that an expert would have. But instead of going to and listening to the experts, the senators chose a body that they knew and trusted because it fit within their understanding of the world, which was that they hadn't been sexually harassed. And so let's just bring in what we're comfortable with, not a process that speaks to the needs of people who are victims. And they were more concerned really with getting to the vote than getting all of the information that the public needed to inform their vote and to understand what was happening before them. And that's one reason I think so many people left those hearings thinking, what just happened here? How was this supposed to work? Because we knew this wasn't working. The failure to have a proper investigation and the failure to rely on experts. There was a Dr. Louise Fitzgerald, just to name one of the experts, that was there with the skills and training and experience about sexual harassment out of the academy, who was ready and willing to testify, but was not called upon. They refused to call social scientists, trained professionals, advocates, who knew and understood the issues and methods and typical responses of harassers and victims in order to get to the truth. And they turned away three witnesses, three other African American women whose experiences were similar with mine. So I sort of lump all of those things together for us to think about how process matters, how getting all the information matters, how not being so anxious to have a vote on a matter matters. Okay? So one of the other things that they did was that the Senate applied the wrong burden of proof. Now, throughout, both the Democrats and the Republicans kept saying, Clarence Thomas is guilty. Oh, sorry, that was Freudian. Clarence Thomas is innocent until proven guilty. He's innocent until proven guilty. But he wasn't being charged with a crime. At the very, to really understand that, and what they kept saying was that when they start talking about guilt and innocent until proven guilty, they're applying the criminal standard to what was a civil rights issue. And really, it wasn't even a civil rights issue. It was, is this person qualified to sit on the country's highest court in a lifetime appointment? Or does this raise questions about his quality? But even if you looked at it as a civil rights violation, sexual harassment, like other civil rights violations, has always been judged by a preponderance of the evidence standard. Not by, beyond a reasonable doubt criminal standard. Now, why is that significant? Well, because we are still looking and struggling with that standard today. We're still trying to figure out, and we've gone back and forth. Now, I would just say this. I'm going to leap ahead to where we are today on this one, because it is, I think this is critical. This is critical on every college campus. Think about what that means. There are two problems that I'm having with this. How can sexual harassment, once the courts have said that it is subject to the laws, the civil rights laws, it is subject to being brought in terms of claims under Title VII, if you're in the workplace, or Title IX on college campuses. We're talking about civil rights violations at that point. How can we say we're going to treat that differently from every other civil rights violation? We're going to apply a criminal standard to sexual harassment and sexual assault. Now, that to me is extremely dangerous in this climate, because once we decide that civil rights claim is subject to a criminal standard of proof, then what else in the civil rights laws will be subject to that standard? Is everything then going to be lifted to the burden of having to prove beyond a reasonable doubt every civil rights violation? Now, I suspected that in some ways this Justice Department may want to take us there. But I suggest to you that this could be a very dangerous slippery slope for civil rights law. But just in terms of the academy, many of the infractions that academies, academic institutions enforce are judged by a preponderance of an evidence standard. Cheating, for one. Drug use on campus, if it's enforced at all. Not judged by a criminal law standard. So how are we going to then start to think about sexual harassment and sexual assault differently? And is it a wise thing to do? And what is the impact then on gender equality if we begin to do that? We haven't thought those things through, and I don't think we can get through all of that tonight. But what I'd like to say is that this innocent until proven guilty was an alternative fact that was manufactured by the Senate. Thomas wasn't going to be locked up in a Senate jail. They don't exist. It was created as sort of, well, let's just throw this out there because people probably wouldn't know. And as I said, the decisions were more political than in the best interest of the courts or the individuals who would be bringing claims in the future. But the alternative facts didn't stop there. Orrin Hatch waived a copy of The Exorcist to show that my testimony was possibly demonically inspired. Senator Danforth proposed erotomania as the reason for my testimony, when most people didn't know what erotomania was, and I'm not sure Senator Danforth did either. But it was another way of saying, you know, these women who come forward are just hysterical and crazy. Senator Simpson claimed that a sexual harasser would have to be a monster or a crazy person, when in fact harassers, if you're thinking 9 out of 10 women have been harassed, there would have to be like a lot of really crazy people running around, running in offices. In fact, what we know about harassers is that these are people we often show deference to. We put in positions of power, and they use that power and harassment as a tool of that power. So there were many opportunities for the Senate to interject fact, but instead they relied on myths. In their own very limited thinking about what these issues were really meaning. I think perhaps the most dangerous in terms of race relations was Clarence Thomas's word himself, where he talked about being a victim of high-tech lynching for uppity blacks. And it was through this appropriation of racial stereotypes that Thomas was able to portray himself as a man unjustly accused, a victim of racism. And why do I say that this was the most dangerous? And what do I actually, my takeaway from that is that it was a very, I will say, dishonest use of race in ways that really demean the experiences of individuals who had family members victimized by lynching. And it was an undermining of me as an African American woman, and a use of me as an African woman to fit a narrative, to sort of be pushed into a narrative that never existed historically. The idea that African American women, that black men were lynched because of African American women's words just was fiction. Absolute fiction. It wasn't even alternative facts. It was pure fiction. It was so ahistorical. But what it did was to set us all back in our understanding of the abuse that African American women had actually experienced at the hands of men of all races. So the Senate wasn't unique in its failings. They weren't unique even in when Simpson threatened that I would be faced with real harassment and called sexual harassment crap. What the Senate was doing was telling all victims to shut up and stop complaining, that nothing would be done to address their grievances. Now, the spreading of disinformation, operating on their own alternative reality, when they should have prioritized truth-seeking and government accountability to the country's best interest in the integrity of the judicial system. And we see this today. The inability to really search for the truth, or the unwillingness to search for the truth in making governmental decisions. And that's where we are. So how did we turn that around? Well, we had record numbers of women coming forward with sexual harassment complaints because the pundits had said women won't come forward now. After witnessing the government's worst practices, they will assume that they will never be heard. But in fact, the opposite happened. African American women responded, a group responded by buying an ad in the New York Times. 1,600 rallied and collected $50,000 to place this full-page ad in the New York Times to really put the story of African American women's experiences back in the place in the public conversation where it should have been, but which had been sort of obscured by the hearing. Now, this may seem like a minor thing, but it was not. It was a sign of a growing black feminism and a base and a feminism and a thought, a thinking that continues to grow today, and really is the growing intersectionality movement and thinking. But so we responded, women responded to turn this around. They responded by running for office. They responded by supporting political candidates. They responded by raising issues of sexual harassment. The pundits were wrong. Women were stronger than we thought. Employers responded to complaints. In many cases, employees insisted that they respond. So employers instituted policies and procedures where none had existed. People did work just by stepping up and sharing their stories with their friends and their families. And I often say that the hidden headline, it should have been the headline of 1991, was not my story, but the fact that thousands of women told their stories. They had decided that they had enough of waiting silently and suffering under sexual extortion and other abuses on their jobs. So they came forward. And even just the telling and the sharing among themselves was a breakthrough. So in response to this government mishandling, in response to the government's failure to act over years, we pushed the issue forward into ourselves instead. And in many ways, that is how we got to where we were in 2008. And I'm not saying that President Obama did everything that could have been done. But what I am saying was that 2008 election really did sort of culminate and get us to a place where all of those years of work since 1991 got us to a point, not where we had resolved all the issues of gender inequality or racial inequality or identity, sexual identity inequality. It did get us, however, to a point where we could publicly respond to them. And there were advances during the Obama administration. Now, there were failures too. And I happen to think the beer summit was a colossal one. But there was more significant work that was being done. And the conversation and the mood about racial equality was starting to move forward. And it was certainly moving forward on the issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault on campus. The 2011 Dear Colleague letter was one of those movements forward, where the Department of Education finally issued guidance. And that struggle continued. But since that 2011 issue letter, I believe that the institutions that we live and work in have started to step up, to develop their own policies and procedures, to develop some rules about appropriate behavior on college campuses. It's not entirely done on the college campuses, and who knows where it will land at this point. But this is now the post-Obama era that I'm talking about. We have made some advances. And it's not just at the college level. I believe that because of what happened in 2008, when the country took a good look at itself and says, how do we become an inclusive community? That inclusive community that was represented by Grant Park. Remember the park at Grant Park, at the light of the election, the Grant Park filled with people of all different backgrounds, Grant Park in Chicago, to celebrate that election. And I do believe that at that point the country said, can we all begin, can the entire country begin to look like Grant Park? And in this next 4 to 8 years, what are the issues that we're going to have to address? And we have addressed many of them. We do have Supreme Court rulings on same-sex marriage that we had thought were going to be decades in the making. And it came about because we had this image in our public consciousness of what an inclusive community could look like and what it could be. And we were willing to do the work to make sure it happened. Now, we had a government as a partner, but certainly it was our work, whether as individuals or part of a university, that got us there. The EEOC has actually convened task forces of advocates, consultants, and business representatives that are providing real, concrete evidence of harm that sexual harassment causes to workers. And the big headline from that is that employers are now sitting down with advocates to address the issue. That was 2 summers ago. The American Bar Association is working to respond to sexual harassment. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine have been convening meetings and conferences and workshops for the past year on how to address the impact of sexual harassment on its victims in science, engineering, and medicine. We aren't there yet. We aren't at that place of an inclusive community. But we are certainly not where we were in the 80s or the 90s. So, how do we get past this moment? How do we recapture this idea when we do have an individual in the White House who believes, or claims at least on tape, that there are men who are powerful, so powerful and popular that they can just do whatever they want to women. And then justifies it by saying, well, that's just what men do. They talk about sexually assaulting women. How do we get past that to, in this era, when we have people who will not stand up against sexually predatory behavior and call it for what it is, criminal abuse? How do we get that when we have this and so many other issues that we have to address? We can remember Grant Park, but the Obama era is over. And so we are now in a post-Obama America. It is another moment that is not simply political. It is cultural. It is sociological. It is a shift. And the backlash against the era that was before us and the advances that we made in it are real. I don't have to list all of the things that I think that this era reflects, but I will just name a few. Misogyny, open misogyny, bigotry, racist xenophobia, white nationalism are just a few. We look at the statistics and we know that hate crimes are up. We look at the statistics and we know that scores now of trans Black women have been murdered without any response. But we also have to be mindful of something else that's going on. And I think this is something that this is an area where we as the Academy can have an impact. In 2014, the Obama administration brokered an agreement with industry leaders whereby hundreds of companies pledged to collect information on pay aggregated by gender and race. The idea was to make it easier for people and companies to tell whether their payment structure caused gender and racial pay gaps. Last month, the Trump administration released those businesses from pay equity pledge. They're what's called a pay equity pledge. But it said on their website, you can find the names of these companies that have taken the pledge on the Obama White House archive. This relocation of the data reminded me that soon after the inaugural White House staff removed the LGBT rights page. So I went to the website where it should have been, and I got a message thanking me for my interest in this subject and ultimately directing me to the Obama archives. But I was also instructed to stay tuned as they continue to update the whitehouse.gov LGBTQ page. More recently, the Trump administration removed data on sexual assault from the White House website. This followed an announcement the Office of the President is considering closing the White House Council on Girls, Women and Girls, under whose auspices the data was gathered. So I ask you, what kind of law and policy are we going to be putting in place where data disappears? Where data is not a priority? And what are we as the Academy going to do about it? What kind of policies could we expect? Well, President Trump has revoked the Obama Fair Pay and Safe Workplace rules for federal contractors and signed into law a bill that will restrict access to family planning and contraceptive support for low-income women, which is a particular problem for rural women. This move, according to Lauren Stiller-McLean, these actions fly in the face of considerable evidence that access to family planning and contraception provides social and family benefits and reduces women's poverty levels. Now, think back to 1991 and my assessment of what was going on. We refused to look at the data about sexual harassment. We refuse to look at the research. We refuse to call experts. We even refuse to call some witnesses. The policies that come out of a process like that are always lacking. So how do we hold the current administration accountable for collecting the data that is going to promote gender equality in this country, if those things are being erased from their system? Now, some of you may be saying, well, they'll probably be somewhere. They'll probably be doing. But what we know is that what you put on that White House website is a statement of what your priorities are. And if you move sexual assault off, if you move LGBT rights off, what does that say about priorities for equality? If you move historically black colleges into the White House and then don't give them any support, what does that say about race? If the Justice Department pushes back on Enforcement Voting Rights Act, what does that say about racial equity in the future of this country? Well, it says to me that it's not a priority. But it also says that the investment in the inclusive community, forget about all the other signals that we've gotten. The investment in the inclusive community is not there. So where is it going to come from? Well, with all that big old dark cloud I just painted over, I think there is a silver lining. And I think it is particularly a silver lining for those of us in the academy. There is a chance, truly, to reimagine equality. We are in an era now where we have more data, and data that is more readily available to us. We have the skills and the intellectual resources that we need to ask the right questions and to do the proper analysis of that data. It's like communications. We have many ways now to communicate our messaging. Not only can we collect the information and analyze the information, we can actually broadcast it in ways that we could not have 20 years ago even. And we have a responsibility to do so. The past 6 decades has brought us African and African American Studies programs. They have brought us Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies programs. They brought us feminist sociologists. The work that our groups do within the academy doesn't have to stay in the academy. It can be a guide for change, for bringing us back to the idea that an inclusive community is not only good, but it is possible. We now have more tools and more resources than we ever had to make this happen with or without government partners. Now, with all of those gains, we also have a public energy behind us. Those marches that happened in January all over the globe prove that there is public energy behind our efforts, our thinking, to be a better community. We actually now have schools that are saying, look, yes, it has been a struggle to protect the interests and the due process rights of every student. But we know now that doing so is in our best interest to protect victims against sexual harassment. We have schools that are getting on board with this. And we even have businesses. Hundreds of people signed the Pay Equity Pledge. There are businesses that are willing to be partners. Business leaders who are standing up standing up against bathroom bills. You've got the NFL, not the most liberal group of folks, standing up for free speech and the right to protest against police brutality. We are in a much better place. The academy can play a special role as we move forward. We teach, we research, and we do scholarship. We spread the word about knowledge publicly. Not fake news, not alternative facts, but information founded in solid research and facts. But to play that role, we have to address bias in our own walls. On college campuses, we have to clean up our own house. And we have to do so in some ways, and this is hard because, you're going to be saying, oh, well, we have our traditions. We have to acknowledge the contributions that many of us are making to this knowledge base that don't make it in the top 5 journals, that don't make it, into the prestigious accrediting organizations that acknowledge us as scholars. We have to know that knowledge is bigger than what we thought it was and what we were taught it was when we were in school. That's going to be difficult. But it is necessary for us to move forward, that we value all of the members of our community and their unique contributions. It is the only way to have an inclusive community. Now, I know for you, some of you are saying, well, I don't do advocacy, Professor Hill. Well, you don't have to. Your pure research can support policy. But even if you're like, I don't want my pure research used for public policy, or I don't want to be involved with that, you don't have to do that. I support you. But you can support people who are saying, I want my research to be used to create a better society. The other thing that I think we need to do is keep records. We need to keep records. We need to collect this information. And we don't just need to keep the records that the government might produce. But the records we know need to be kept. It is written kept, I don't know how I said keep. To measure true equality as lived experience. Now, I will tell you, I was talking about the pledge. Pledge is about pay equity. And one of the signature the Obama administrative efforts was to get gender equity on the table and also to deal with the issue of child care. And those are great. Gender equity, pay equity, and child care. But we in the academy, people in women's gender studies and sexuality studies and African American studies and the sociologists know that we also need to keep a record about fair pay for those people who are taking care of our children and who are taking care of our elders. So we can carry that message and that information. And we can do it better today than we could have ever in the 90s. We've come a long way, so do not be dismayed. We have the tools that will move us forward and to capture this idea of an inclusive community in this era that we are living in today and beyond. And we have a responsibility to do so. On a personal note, just let me say this. As I said before, I offered my testimony really as a member of the bar, as a citizen, as an individual who had benefited from the laws that brought us closer to equality. As a child who was born, I'd say, in the Brown versus Board of Education era, at a time when we were beginning to live up to the promises of equality in this country. And I grew up with people who, in fact, looked at me and said, we ought to be giving the same opportunity to this brown, black girl who is living in rural Oklahoma. And she should not be held back because of her race, because of her gender, or because of her class. And I have benefited from that way of thinking for the past 60 years, 61 to be exact. I will say, though, that in 1991, none of that seemed to matter. None of what I had done, none of what I had worked for seemed to matter. And it was a time where my faith in what I had believed this country could be about was shaken. However, in those hearings, I like to say, they warned me not to speak up. Senator Simpson, in particular, told me the consequences of what would happen if I spoke up. Nevertheless, I persisted. Because I truly do believe that we can have an inclusive community if we all work on it. If you ask me if I would do the testimony again, I would say, yes, I would. I would do it all over again. I found my voice. I will not lose it. I will continue to speak out. I will say, in the words, to paraphrase Shirley Chisholm, I want to be remembered as a woman who lived in the 21st century and who dared to be a catalyst for change. The Trump era will pass. The inclusive community is one that we must fight to build, first to restore, and to build. And it requires each of us to make a personal investment to make it a reality. And so I ask tonight for you to think about, what will your investment be? The theme of the International Women's Day celebration this year was Be Bold for Change. So I ask you here tonight in Purdue, be bold. Be bold for the community that you want, that you know we deserve. Draw upon your most courageous self to dream a world where we not only confront inequalities, but where we prevent them from occurring. Thank you.
A few minutes for questions. So we have a couple of microphones up here at the front. If you would like to ask a question, please don't be shy. Okay, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was struck over the course of your talk about the relative power of the court, of Congress, and of the executive office. And I was curious, just given what Dr. DeVos has been doing in terms of turning back a lot of Obama-era guidance for universities, where you saw the locus for change. Is this something that we should work on through our congresspeople? Is the most robust sort of legislation that's going to come out on this coming from the Supreme Court? And how do we sort of persist in spite of this?
Well, I think you've listed all of the things, and all of the above are necessary. We have, one of the things that has come out of the past few years of Title IX is a number of organizations like End Rape on Campus and Know Your Nine, advocacy organizations specifically aimed at addressing sexual assaults on college campuses. They haven't developed a strategy. And I think you should tap into those kinds of resources if you're interested in working. Their strategy includes working with Congress, talking with the individuals who are in Congress. And, you know, I'm very proud to say that this year we have women of color in record number elected to the Senate. Not very many, but hey, it's like, you know, triple the number that I've ever been. So we've got people in Congress who have been responding to this issue. That's one of the things that we can do with our data and our research and our information is to provide them with the information to help support their work. I am sure that there will be cases too that go through the federal system. If, in fact, there is a differential in terms of the standard of proof for sexual assault that will have a disproportionate impact on women, then I am sure that there will be challenges to that differential standard of proof in the courts. So, yes. And there are always elections. There can be changes of the guard. So I think all of those fronts are necessary. As a matter of fact, you know, that's in some ways what happened in 1991. It wasn't just let's look at, you know, this one strategy. Let's look at all of the different ways that government can have an impact, and we will be effective. We haven't resolved the problems, but we are incrementally moving forward. But your question is a good question. You can work through advocacy groups. You can work individually to support the efforts of people who are in this House and Senate who want to make positive change. You can support the courts. One of the things that I think in terms of court support is that you don't have to file your own lawsuit, but you may want to. I think class action suits can be an effective way to make broad-based change. But the amicus brief is an important tool because very often now judges are looking at the amicus briefs, the content and the arguments and the stories that they tell that will support the line of reasoning that they're using. So there are multiple strategies to affect multiple institutions, and with these new organizations that have come up, there are different ways to get those strategies and to have them actually have an impact.
Okay, so Professor Hill, we actually have 3 people lined up here. So depending on how quickly we get through them,
when did I move in?
Right. Okay, so go ahead, ask your question.
I would like to ask, what would your advice be for girls of the younger generation?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, just understand what it is. Start to understand what it is that you want. out of life. And I always say, find your resources. Who are the people, what are the things that are going to support you to be what you want to do? Sometimes we can find them at home. Sometimes that's not possible. At schools, you may have teachers. And don't be shy about asking these people, going to them and say, you know, I want to be a Purdue University professor. How do I do that? Dream big. That's a big dream, Purdue University professor. And then, ask people who are doing those things. What do I have to do? I think people are really kind of shy about saying, oh, I'm not going to ask a teacher, or I'm not going to ask some professor who I've never heard or who's never heard of me. But I think you would be quite surprised at how responsive they will be. Now, some of them may not respond because their email boxes are full. And some of them may say to you, well, you should talk to this person who is on the administrative staff here. I met some of those people who would be happy to talk with you. But dream about what you want to do, even if you make a list. Yeah, well, I'd like to be a university professor, I want to be an astronaut, and I want to be, veterinarian. Any of those things. Yeah, I have a veterinarian in the office. So there you go. So there are people around who will support your dreams, especially in a college community. But you can start with your own school. Make a list, contact those different people who are doing those things, and ask them what did you do to become who you are, and how can I get to do that? What do you want to do?
I don't know, I'm not sure.
What grade are you in?
6th grade.
6th grade? Okay, that's probably why you're not exactly sure what you're doing.
I know it's unbelievable.
So have you thought about what you would like to do in life? Or are you just too shy to say?
The second one.
Because you think it's outrageous?
Maybe.
It's not. Well, why don't you whisper to me? Ooh. Do you know any? Do you know any singers? Have you talked to them about what I'm saying? You haven't? Have you talked to them? Have you talked to them about being a singer? Have you? Well, we'll talk to them. You won't?
I did meet Danny Glover once.
You did meet him? Can he sing? No, I don't think he can either. Okay, he's a nice guy though. But go out there and listen to those singers, talk to those singers, get involved with things that allow you to sing. And don't be shy about it. Somebody's got to be singing for us. It might as well be you.
Okay, Jeremiah.
Well, first I wanted to say, Black on Crack, how you doing?
Max. I would just say Max. Everybody hears that.
All right, but my question is more so trying to get your opinion on something. I was on the internet, like people do nowadays, and I came across this article, and it was talking about, the title was "Straight Black Men Are the White People of Black People," and he was basically going on to say that intraracially, black males' relationship to and with black women is similar to whiteness' relationship with us. So I just wanted to get your opinion on that, and if that is the case, because it was on one of my friends' profile, and there was a lot of other people like her that was feeling that type of way. So I'm trying to figure out how we can alleviate that situation or with proper steps.
Well, it's a very provocative to say. I don't try to equate things that, it's a good way to start conversation, but I think the goal of making those kinds of equations is to actually figure out how they're different. And they don't have to be the same to be relevant. And so I think we've got to kind of get beyond that. Well, this is just like X. Racism today is just like something else, or sexism. I can't even think in those terms because I don't know that it is necessarily helpful, except for us to interrogate how things are and really figure out what is sexism, what is racism, what is homophobia, and how does it get expressed differently at different times in different people's lives. And so I would not entirely reject your friend's post, but I would simply say, yeah, in some ways those things might be the same, but each deserves its own analysis. And so the effort to try to make them the same is really it shouldn't be the end of our inquiry. It should just be the beginning. Okay?
Okay, this will be our final question.
Oh, if I answer too quickly, is that okay? Okay, because we got 3 people. Oh, she's got next. Okay.
So I have one question for me and one question for her. So for me, I was watching Henry Gates Jr., his mini documentary, and part of that was talking about how black women kind of sided with Clarence Thomas during the whole case, and they had their whole black women for Clarence Thomas. So I wanted to know your thoughts on just how that affected you, having people that looked like you and maybe you would have expected to be behind you on the other person's side.
Okay. Well, that actually was a very hurtful experience, to be sort of told by black people that I had been a traitor to my race, that I was doing damage to my race by bringing up this subject. But I've come to understand that in many ways that was just a reaction to a history of racism that they have experienced. It was not, and the other thing is that you learn not to accept political organization, which is what the black women for Clarence Thomas was, for genuine position. Because there were, as I said with that ad that was taken out in the New York Times, there were, as the kids say, I had lots of friends who supported me, and a number of them were African American women. But it was hurtful to be put in that position. What I've also learned is that has happened to women in different communities, whether it's a racial community or a church community. Oh, you can't raise these issues because the minister is so, or the rabbi is so important to this community. If you raise that, you're going to hurt everybody. The school communities, oh, you can't say that about something happening at Purdue or Oklahoma State or Brandeis because then they'll think everybody here. So that is kind of a natural reaction. To close it up, I just say, look, there is no community that is a marginalized community that can survive and grow and prosper if half of their population is held back. that as women, we cannot grow and prosper if we are willing to ignore the racism and homophobia and sexism that holds women back because of their race, sexual identity, or religion. So we've got to work on all these issues. And I think we're getting to that point where we understand. What's the second question?
And the question for her was, she just wanted to know your thoughts on the whole Charlottesville situation.
Yeah, on Charlottesville. So, give me a little bit more on that one.
Yes. I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut off the students that are asking for questions, but I wanted to know your thoughts in terms of an inclusive community when we consider what happened in Charlottesville and really the role of gender that in some ways is absent from the narrative, right? That became really public.
Right.
That is women, white and black women, and the differences in which they voted for in this recent election, or in the responses maybe around nationalism or other things that I thought might be worth that.
Yeah,
might benefit from your perspective.
I think that when we were talking about Charlottesville, that there were women who were among the white nationalists that didn't get a lot of screen time, but who existed and are part of that movement. That's always been the case. I think what happens, though, is that we look at this is sort of an indication of maybe what happened in the election. Well, why did white women vote for this man who had bragged about sexually assaulting women? Why did they vote for someone who began his campaign on a platform of racist xenophobia? And so and then we think, well, is the sisterhood nothing? Does it not really mean anything? I can't really answer that question, but I do think what we have to do is to acknowledge that there are tensions. That it's not just, women are against, or as the question came up earlier, that black women are for you or against you. The whole landscape is very, very nuanced at this point. And I think one of the things that we have to avoid doing, though, is to look squarely in the eye and say, honestly, how much that vote meant to promote misogyny and racism. Now, people may not want to hear that or see it, but I think we've got to be able to confront that. I think people probably weren't even thinking that they were voting. If they were thinking they were voting for, my family, and they don't even know the contents of words like our heritage. What does that mean? And so I think, we've just got a lot of work to do to unpack some of the biases that have been baked into our country and how it's been signaled but not exactly called out so that everybody is clear this is what's going on. Ironically, I think we're getting a clear message of it now in the post-election that is undeniable. And I believe that there has been a shift in attitude because you can no longer deny what is being promoted. And hopefully there will be a response, an appropriate response, when it comes time for us to think about what is in our best interest in the next few years, whether we're talking about congressional elections or the presidential election in the future. But we've kind of glossed over some of those issues, and they were glossed over in the election of 2016, but they've really come back to bite us now. And we've got to think, I like to say, and I use the Grant Park idea, how do you want to see this country? Do you want it to be like the Grant Park idea, where we had this moment, and it was made fun of and corny, this sort of kumbaya moment? Or do you want the vision of the United States to be Charlottesville? Those are some choices. They're stark choices, and some people would say, well, it's too stark and it's too extreme. But right now, that is what we have. And so we have to deal honestly with that reality. And I know what my choices are. I know what my choice would be. And I like to think I know what the choice that many other Americans would make as well.
I overlooked somebody, so I'm just going to allow one last question, just really quickly. Go ahead.
I personally would feel uncomfortable deciding in a case of sexual assault based on non-ontological proof. And obviously it's too high of a standard to ask for ontological proof in this kind of case because of practical reasons. But what is the moral justification for not asking for ontological proof? Because it's a very serious allegation. It's like you have ruined this person's life, possibly traumatized them permanently, and we can't ask for them to offer ontological proof.
So what do you say? How are you defining the proof that we're asked that you think would make you comfortable?
I'm not. So the proof that would make me comfortable, obviously, is beyond reasonable doubt. But that standard is unreasonable.
Oh, but what proof would you want to have? Just tell me, would somebody have to have been threatened with a knife, beaten up?
That's not the question I'm asking. The question I'm asking is the standard that is currently in place, right, is reasonable. You can't ask for ontological proof, like proof of it being there that is immutable. But what is the moral justification for this? I understand the practical justification that it'd be impossible to receive ontological proof, but what is the moral distinction between receiving ontological proof in a murder case, for example, and not receiving ontological proof because it would be difficult to prove that way?
You are talking about murder in a criminal case, right?
Yes.
And in a rape case in the criminal justice system, the standard would be beyond a reasonable doubt. We're not changing what happens in the criminal court. What happens in a school or a university is not a criminal proceeding. And therefore, there's no criminal standard. Now, the reason that we have a criminal standard in criminal court is because the individual is going to be subject to imprisonment and, in some criminal cases, the death penalty. But let me give you an example. There is different standards. So, for example, the O.J. Simpson case. Acquitted in a criminal court. You can agree or disagree about that. But when there was a civil suit brought, there was a lower standard of proof. Now, you won the civil suit against O.J. Simpson, and he has, a judgment against him for money. But he's not in danger of going to jail because of that, anyway. That's not going to send anybody to jail. It's not going to deprive anybody of life or liberty. And that's why you have different standards of proof depending on the setting. For every civil rights violation, we have a preponderance of evidence. That means that a group of people who are informed about the problem decide, is it more likely than not? Is there the balance of the evidence? Who does it favor? And, you know, some people say, well, it could just be an ounce more in terms of the complainant. The moral, I think, reasoning behind having that is that we're not talking about depriving a person of life or liberty on the one hand. But on the other hand, if a sexual assault does occur, it can have a life or liberty impact on the victim. And the institution has an obligation to perform. We expel students for any number of things. We punish students or suspend them for any number of things, not based on a criminal sin. But I think the moral reason is to look at the impact of the act that we are talking about occurring, that someone is being accused of. And we're talking not only about the impact on the individual, but the impact on the entire community. And so I think, you know, there are plenty of reasons for us to think, you know, let's not turn this into criminal courts. Let's give both sides an opportunity to respond. Let's get all the evidence. But we don't have to make it the same as a criminal law case. And that has been the way that we treated civil rights. And even then, many times people don't prevail. When we know that in fact something is going wrong, but they don't prevail. So it's not as though that this preponderance of an evidence rule means that every time women who accuse of sexual assault, they're going to prevail. It doesn't happen that way. But it does give individuals a fair chance to be able to go to school, get their education, and know that institutions are trying to protect them and their safety.
So at this point, I would like to thank Professor Hill for her perseverance and for her comments here this evening. It was definitely worth waiting 25 years.
I'll sign you up again. Thank everyone for being here tonight and for your patience and for your good questions. And again, I look forward to seeing Purdue again, maybe in less than 25 years. Thank you.